Well, we're going to do a brief little study tonight. And some of this, if you've been here for 20 years under me, you will have heard some of this at some point in time, perhaps several times. But, I'm a big believer in repetition. It's one of the reasons we always do a review every week when we go through books of the Bible, because, repetition instills it in the memory banks so that one day when you need to recall some particular fact because of the repetition, you should be more capable of recalling that fact. But understand the Synoptic Gospels. We're just going to look at the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, very briefly tonight. And as I said, we're going to go into another book of the Bible here before long. And I've wrestled with teaching on Job, except for the fact that even with all I've been through the last 2 years, I still don't feel adequately prepared to teach on such a subject as suffering. And we've suffered a lot. But we may go ahead and go that direction. I then have to consider whether that's something that I would want to do on Wednesday nights in front of a smaller group, or on Sunday mornings when I'm taking my turn in the pulpit in front of our larger audience. And obviously, the book of Job and suffering, why the righteous suffer, and things of that nature are a subject that all of us, in fact, many throughout Scripture, have asked repeatedly. So anyway, I'm not sure where we're going to go next week. Nevertheless, this week, we're going to be here. Understand what the Synoptic Gospels means. We're basically getting 4 eyewitness testimonies of one person from different vantage points. I've shared this example before. If someone is going to write a book about me, it would be a comic book for sure. But, Steve might write a chapter as Paul, my brother. Cindy might write a chapter as Paul, my husband. Mom might write a chapter on Paul, my son. Brother Jerry might write a chapter on Paul, my friend. All would be accurate, 100%. But they would all be written from a different perspective. And that's what the Synoptic Gospels are. You've got 4 different viewpoints, or 4 different observations, 4 different views of the one same Messiah. Now, as we get in, recognize that the Bible has been well established for centuries, as a matter of fact, at least 4 centuries. The first century historian, a former Jew, in fact, he was a rebel that was very active in the Galilee when Israel sought to rebel against Roman tyranny in roughly, 66 A.D., roughly 65, 66 A.D., when they rebelled, which was put down in the north by around 68, and of course Jerusalem was captured and conquered by 70 A.D. But Flavius Josephus actually, in order to save his own skin, surrendered rather than committing suicide with all of his other cohorts that had agreed to do so. But he surrendered to save his neck, and wound up being adopted into the royal family and serving as a very valuable historian, documenting much of what we know about the time of Christ and even times before that. And Josephus said this in his commentary: "We have but 22 books containing the history of all time." As you've heard Brother Dan, as he's done his teaching beginning in Genesis, that is in fact true. There's only one book that gives an actual eyewitness account of creation, and that is, of course, the Bible. Books that are believed to be defined, Josephus says. Of these, 5 belong to Moses, containing his laws and the traditions of the origin of mankind down to the time of his death. From the death of Moses to the reign of Artaxerxes, the prophets who succeed Moses wrote the history of the event that occurred in their own time in 13 books. The remaining 4 books comprise hymns to God and precepts for the conduct of human life. From the days of Artaxerxes to our own times, every event has indeed been recorded, but these recent records have not been deemed worth of equal credit with those which preceded them, on account of the failure of the exact succession of prophets. There is practical proof of the spirit in which we treat our scriptures. For although so great an interval of time has now passed, not a soul has ventured to add to or remove or to alter a syllable. And it is the instinct of every Jew from the day of his birth to consider these scriptures as the teaching of God and to abide by them, and if need be, cheerfully to lay down his life on their behalf. So here we are in roughly 70, 80 A.D., and Josephus is documenting the fact that what we call the Old Testament, the Tanakh, the Torah, the Nevi'im, and the Ketuvim, the Torah, the writings, and the prophets, or the prophets and the writings. Nevi means prophet, Nevi'im is plural, so Nevi'im and the Ketuvim, the law, the prophets, and the writings would make up what we know as our 39 books of the Old Testament. Now, Josephus references it at 22 books. Actually, the current Jewish Tanakh has 24. Now, there's reason. There's not 2 books missing, but Josephus combined Judges and Ruth together as one book, and he also combined Ecclesiastes and Jeremiah, which is certainly understandable, as one book. So the same 39 books in a different order are the 24 books of the Jewish Tanakh that we know in our day and age. Now, Jesus verified the Old Testament. As a matter of fact, as you go throughout the Gospels, as give a record of Jesus' actions, or many of Jesus' actions, while walking on the earth, Jesus documented the biblical account of creation in Matthew 19. He documented Adam and Eve in Mark 10. He documented Abel in Luke 11. He documented Noah and the flood in Matthew 24. He documented Abraham's existence in John 8. He documented Sodom and Gomorrah in Luke 10. He documented Lot and his wife in Luke 17. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in Matthew 8. Manna from heaven in John 6. Moses and the bronze serpent in John 3, Jonah and the sea creature in Matthew 12, Queen of Sheba in Matthew 12, Moses authoring the law in Luke 16, Daniel authoring the book of Daniel, and Isaiah authoring the book of Isaiah. As our friend Frank Turek says so often, if you believe Jesus, then you get the Old Testament thrown in. If you prove that you trust Jesus, then the Old Testament is thrown in as being verifiable, because Jesus certainly believed in the Old Testament. As a matter of fact, the day of his resurrection, when he was walking on the Emmaus Road and he joined those other 2 disciples that were so forlorn, as they were still trying to make sense out of all of the events that had happened at that day concerning Jesus' crucifixion and then his missing body. Well, Jesus had withheld his identity. He'd covered his face or something along those lines because they didn't recognize who he was. And as he was walking with them, he asked, what's wrong with you guys? They basically said, what, haven't you heard? Haven't you heard what's going on? What do you mean, what's wrong with us? And then Jesus, in verse 27, Luke 24, beginning at Moses and all the prophets, he expounded unto them in how many of the Scriptures? All the Scriptures. That would be the entirety of the Jewish Bible. So in all 22 books, what Josephus referenced, 24 books from the Jewish New Testament or Jewish Tanakh, and 39 books that we know as our Old Testament, all the Scripture references Jesus. It all points to him. Now, as we've talked about in some of our past weeks, understand the makeup of the Bible. You got the first 39 books, which we've just read Josephus' testimony of those. And we transition after some 400 years of silence into what we know as the New Testament or the Latter Testament. Really consists of 3 sections. You've got the epistles to the churches, the day and age in which we live, the ecclesia, the called out assembly, both Jew and Gentile. Whosoever shall call upon the name of the Lord shall be saved, leading up to the time of the rapture. And then God focuses again that final 7 years on Israel and dealing with the disobedient Gentile nations, ultimately culminating in the battle of Armageddon, and then the millennial reign of Christ. So those letters, those church epistles, those pastoral epistles, are what we get our operations of doctrine, specificity of behavior as far as things are expected of us as Gentiles in the local assembly, and how we're to organize and things of that nature. But before that, you've got the transition, this bridge, which carries you over from the Gospels unto the epistles. And then you've got the Gospels. Well, what are the Gospels exactly? Well, that's exactly what we're going to talk about here this evening, these Synoptic Gospels. They prove without doubt that Jesus is, in fact, the promised Messiah that was prophesied throughout the entirety of the Old Testament, beginning in Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, where we had the first evangelistic sermon preached by God himself, God the Father himself, with the sacrifice of that innocent substitute and the bloody skins taken to cover the nakedness of Adam and Eve, and the promise of the future seed of the woman that would crush the head of the seed of the serpent. So the Gospels actually are 4 different eyewitness testimonies proving in a court of law without question that Jesus is in fact the promised Messiah. Let's begin by reading in Isaiah chapter 11, and we'll get our background. Now understand, Isaiah lived about 100 and what? Nearly 200 years before, 160 years before Israel or Jerusalem was conquered by Nebuchadnezzar. So this was before they were ever taken out of the land the first time. And Isaiah the prophet pronounced this prophecy. And there shall come forth a rod. Again, that rod could be an indication of a staff of rule, a ruler's rod. Also a shepherd's staff, out of the stem of Jesse. So understand that the prophecy is that the house of David is so downtrodden and dilapidated at this point in time that it doesn't even merit the reference to the house of David. Instead, it's referred to as the stump of David's father, Jesse. And a branch, notice that word is capitalized in our KJV, shall grow out of his roots. And the sevenfold Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and the fear of the Lord. And shall make him, now notice the references to the branch as a he and a him. So this is a person that's growing up out of the stump of the decimation of the household of David and the stump of Jesse. And shall make him of quick understanding in the fear of the Lord. And he shall not judge after the sight of his eyes, neither reprove with the hearing of his ears, but with righteousness shall he judge the poor, and reprove with equity for the meek of the earth. And he shall smite the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips shall he slay the wicked. Folks, understand, in the ancient days, the king was supposed to be the shepherd looking out for the well-being of all the people. And as you read the law, you recognize that where we get the expression, justice is blind, it actually comes from Mosaic law. There was to be no favoritism, neither to the rich nor to the poor. All were to be governed with equitable, just justice. And we all in our country know that we were created equal in the eyes of the law and under the eyes and authority of God. One day we are going to have just government, and we will be ruling and reigning with him. I can't even imagine what that will be like, but I can't wait for it. I'll tell you what, there won't be a lot of the current voting populace will not be here during that particular reign. And righteousness shall be the girdle of his loins, and faithfulness the girdle of his reins. And in this period of time, there will be peace on earth, which Micah references, and Isaiah 2 references. And the wolf also shall dwell with the lamb, and the leopard shall lie down with the kid, and the calf and the young lion and the fatling dwell together, and a little child shall lead them. Oops, I must have omitted a passage. Well, I'll just stop right there. I actually was going to go ahead and read down through the rest of that. As a matter of fact, I'll just read from my Bible, because there's something I do want to reference here. And the sucking child shall play on the hole of the asp, and the weaned child shall put his hand on the viper's den. And they shall not hurt nor destroy in all my holy mountain. Again, remember prophetically, a mountain means a government or kingdom. For the earth shall be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. And in that day there shall be a root of Jesse, which shall stand for an ensign of the people, a gathering point, a rallying cry for the people. And to it, that ensign, that root, that branch, shall the Gentiles seek, and his, that it, that branch, It's a hymn. Rest shall be glorious. And it shall come to pass in that day that the Lord shall set his hand again. This is the point I want to point out. The second time to recover the remnant of his people. Now, who would Isaiah have referenced were his people? The church? No. Who would have been God's people according to Isaiah? Israel. That's exactly right. The 12 tribes. God shall set his hand again the second time to recover the remnant of his people, which shall be left from Assyria, and from Egypt, and from Pathros, and from Cush, and from Elam, and from Shinar, and from Hamath, and from the islands of the sea. And he shall set up an ensign for the nations, for the Gentile nations, and shall assemble the outcasts of Israel, and gather together the dispersed of Judah from the four corners of the earth. So you can see here that this is speaking broader than just Zerubbabel's return from captivity in Babylon. This says that the descendants of Judah, they were taken to Babylon. Israel was taken to Assyria. The descendants would be scattered throughout all the nations of the earth. And after they returned to the promised land the second time, then this all would happen where the Messiah establishes his earthly kingdom. Now, what's interesting to note is Israel hadn't been dispersed the first time. Now, we know looking back that there was a dispersion in 587 when Israel was fully crushed after Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the city of Jerusalem. Or Judah was fully crushed at that point in time, and Jerusalem was fully crushed. Then we know that there was a partial gathering in the land, of course, the time of Christ. The representatives of all 12 tribes, although not all Jews were back in the land, we know that at Pentecost, as there were Jews from all over the world that came back together in Acts 2. But there was a representation of all the 12 tribes back in the land operating. And even for a short period of time under the rule of the Maccabees, they had a certain amount of autonomy for about a century. But then they were conquered by Rome, and then they were crushed and dispersed actually after 135 AD. So there's been two dispersions. And the prophet said that they would be out of the land for a long, long time. In fact, Ezekiel says their bones would be scattered and they would be very dry. But God would put them back together again. And they would first be assembled as a mighty army without any ruach or spirit in them. But then, at that point, after the Messiah returns the second time, there would be breath breathed back into that army again. But again, what's interesting is it says here, before they were ever taken out of the land the first time, that it would be after their second return that the Messiah would actually come and fulfill those prophecies that were made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Isn't it amazing? And you can understand where Protestants got it wrong for so long when it comes to eschatology. You know, after Martin Luther and the Reformation and the Protestant denominations came out of Catholicism, they held on to some of the vain traditions, like infant baptism. And they held on to some of the other errors, like eschatology, thinking that the church had replaced Israel in God's promises. Folks, for almost, 1,800 years, there was no Israel. You know what's funny is I go back and I read some sermons many years ago from Billy Sunday that he had preached back around 1900, early 1900s. And he was talking about how one day Israel would be back in the land because God said so. It's amazing that another 40 years later, they were back in the land. And after, Hitler had tried to annihilate them and wipe them out altogether. But folks, for 1,800 years, I'm sure many theologians are sitting here scratching their head going, well, God must be done with Israel. These promises must apply to us. But folks, now we can look back and we see that May the 14th, 1948, Israel was rebirthed. And the ancient cities have been rediscovered and rebuilt right in their very places under their ancient names, just as God said would happen. So again, this will happen. This time of peace with the Messiah, the son of David, ruling and reigning literally from the throne of his father David. I'm just crazy enough to believe that that's exactly what's going to happen. Now, we see here that this word branch is referenced here. And notice the capital B. So let's quickly chase through a few passages in the Bible and see why we came up with 4 synoptic gospels. First, in Jeremiah 23:5, it says this, "Behold, the days come, saith the Lord, that I will raise unto David a righteous," what? And it's capitalized, is it not? "And a king shall reign and prosper, and shall execute judgment and justice in the earth." Well, Matthew was a well-educated Jew. He was a publican by trade. He gave us the most verbose account of Jesus in any of the 4 Gospels. And Matthew presented Jesus as the King of the Jews in response to this prophecy in Jeremiah 23:5 that the branch of the stump of Jesse, the Messiah of King David, would in fact be a king. In fact, David says that. Isaiah says that in Isaiah 9:6. God had made that promise to him, to David as well. First of all, notice in the book of Matthew, we get the genealogy of the king. We get the genealogy of Jesus beginning at Abraham. Why does it begin at Abraham? Because Matthew is strictly a Jewish book, referencing his Jewishness as the King of the Jews. So the genealogy begins at Abraham because Abraham was the original Jew. And you track it down through David, and then you branch from David through Solomon. And you follow the lineage of Solomon all the way down to Joseph, the father-in-law, actually the stepfather, but the father according to the law. He was the adopted father of Jesus, and therefore through this lineage, Jesus actually had the legal right and claim to the throne because he was of the household of David. Okay? We see John the Baptist explicitly saying, "Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand." We see in Matthew Jesus preaching the same message, the gospel of the kingdom. We see the expression, the kingdom of heaven, peculiar to this book alone, but used 32 times in this book. We see the word kingdom is used 50 times. We see the law of the kingdom given in this book. We see the mysteries of the kingdom given in this book. We see Matthew 21:5 is the only one of the 4 Gospels that actually quotes Zechariah 9:9 and references Zechariah 9:9 regarding Jesus' triumphal entry, saying that this fulfilled the prophecy that you would recognize your king because he's going to come riding into Jerusalem humbly, bringing salvation on a donkey's colt. And we see that the establishment of the kingdom given in great detail in the Olivet Discourse account. Remember, we talked about a couple of weeks ago on Sunday that Matthew 24 focuses on when would Jesus establish his kingdom. Lord, when are you going to return and establish the kingdom? Luke 21 answers the question, Lord, when is the temple going to be destroyed and the city destroyed? So 2 different questions are answered in those 2 different accounts that we have combined and call a singular Olivet Discourse. But this one in Matthew specifically references Jesus as King Jesus because that's what the account in Matthew 24 covers. So we see that Matthew deals with the prophecy that the Messiah would in fact be the King of the Jews. Well, Zechariah 3:8 tells us, "Hear now, O Joshua." By the way, that is a Hebrew name. That's the Hebrew name Jesus. Only Joshua was the high priest in the days that Zechariah was prophesying. So this is, I don't know why I said that. I just did. It was that's just some of that trivial information that I probably could have saved about 15 or 20 seconds of time on. Nevertheless, I shared that with you anyway. "O Joshua the high priest, thou and thy fellows that sit before thee, for they are men wondered at. For behold, I will bring forth" what? "My servant, the branch." So we just saw that the branch would be the king of the Jews. And now we find another prophecy saying that the branch would be a servant. Well, Mark, or John Mark, wrote the account that was attributed to Peter as far as these synoptic gospels. And in Mark, we see that no genealogy is given. The only one of the four Gospels where no genealogy is given. And quite frankly, no one cares what the genealogy of a servant or a slave is. We see in Mark that the 12 were constantly squabbling over who would have a greater position when Jesus established his kingdom. And it was in Mark that we get the account where Jesus says, "For whosoever of you shall be chiefest shall be servant of all. And even the Son of Man came not to be ministered unto, but to minister and to give his life a ransom for many." So not only is he the chief servant, but he is the suffering sacrifice given on behalf of the sins of his creation. So we see also in the Gospel of Mark that there are more miracles recorded here in this short 16-chapter book than in any other of the accounts, even in Matthew, which is the longest account. We see that Peter's mother-in-law healed. We see a leper healed. We see the palsied man let down through the roof. We see the man with the withered hand in the synagogue in Capernaum healed. We see many healed by the Sea of Galilee. We see the woman with the issue of blood healed. We see the sick in Nazareth healed. We see the healing of the sick in Gennesaret. We see the deaf and dumb of Decapolis. We see the blind man of Bethesda. We see blind Bartimaeus. And we see countless demons on 8 different occasions. And also we see the daughter of Jairus raised from the dead. So all demonstrating that Jesus came not to be ministered unto, but to minister to us as the branch of the servant. Then we look one more chapter, or one more book, and we see a fulfillment of the prophecy pertaining to Zechariah 6:12. And it says this, "And speak unto him, saying, Thus speaketh Jehovah Sabaoth, the Lord of hosts, Behold the man, whose name is" what? "And he shall grow up out of his place, and he shall build the temple of the Lord." Well, folks, in Luke, by the way, Dr. Luke, we see the humanity of the Messiah as was fulfilled in Jesus. And only in the Gospel according to Luke do we see the record of Jesus' human lineage. We see the lineage traced beginning at Adam and not Abraham. Why? Well, in Matthew, we're only concerned about Jesus being the King of the Jews, so everything began with Abraham. But in Luke, we're dealing with the humanity of Jesus. So the genealogy goes all the way back to the first man, Adam, and tracks all the way down from Adam through Abraham, through David, but not through Solomon. There's a branch through David's son Nathan, and then down that lineage until you get to Miriam, or who we know as Mary, the mother of Jesus. So we see that Jesus was, in fact, of the house and lineage of King David. And we see in the book of Luke the account of documenting the fulfillment of Isaiah 7:14, that a virgin would in fact give birth. We see in Luke the only account of Jesus' birth. In Luke, we see the only account of Jesus being circumcised. Why? Demonstrating that he was, in fact, a male human being, a male child. In Luke, we have the only account of Jesus prior to the beginning of his baptism, his ministry and his baptism by John the Baptist. We see when Jesus was left behind by his parents at the temple at the age of 12, and they came back and found him teaching and dialoguing with the doctors and lawyers. We see a testimony of his humanity given here. In Luke 2:52, it says, "And Jesus increased in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and man." And of course, Jesus had to be a human because according to the law, we could only be redeemed by a near kinsman. So God stepped into humanity. God became flesh in order to redeem his creation. We see the longest account of testing given in the book of Luke, as Jesus was in all points tested as we are, yet without sin. And in Luke, we see the record of Pilate saying, what? "Behold the man." You know, you would think that any of those Levites or priests should have been sensitive to that. And when they heard Pilate standing on the precipice of Antonia Fortress overlooking the court of Gentiles saying, "Behold the man!" Well, look at what he was quoting. Zechariah 6, giving this prophecy of the branch being a man. Behold the man whose name is the branch. And then, of course, we see Pilate giving this testimony. I find no fault in this what? Just man. So we see that Luke, Dr. Luke, gives us the humanity of Jesus in response to that part of the prophecy of the Messiah. And then Isaiah 4:2, we wrap up. By the way, I'm not going to chase that rabbit. In that day, boy, that's discipline. See, I'm getting there. I'm getting better. Yay! In that day shall the branch of the Lord be beautiful and glorious, and the fruit of the earth shall be excellent and comely for them that are escaped of Israel. And in our fourth gospel, the last one was written by John, presenting Jesus as God. So we see that the prophecies said that this branch coming out of the stump of Jesse, the house of David, would in fact be the King of the Jews, answered Matthew. A suffering servant, answered Mark. A human being, answered Luke. And the Son of God, answered in John. And in fact, in John, we have his lineage given. It says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. All things were made by him. Without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. Jump down to verse 14. It said, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And we beheld his glory, the glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. So we see the lineage of the branch of the Lord fulfilled in Jesus. John contains no parables, only truth claims, validated by the power of God. By the way, most of these terms, if not all, in fact, all of them are actually terms of deity. In every one of these I am statements, Jesus was claiming to be God. Some of them more obvious than the other. Of course, we know the 23rd Psalm, the Good Shepherd, and Jesus says that he is the Good Shepherd. He is the true vine. He is the door. He is the light of the world. He is the bread of life. He is the resurrection and the life. He is the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes to the Father except by him. And of course, John concludes here. After Thomas had missed Jesus' first appearance to the other 10, as Thomas was not there in the upper room, and when they told him, Thomas, Jesus appeared to us in his resurrected, glorified body, Thomas said, I'll not believe unless I can see him for myself and touch the nail prints in his hands and the imprint in his side, spear imprint in his side. Well, a week later, Jesus showed up again. Thomas just and said, here, go ahead, Thomas, check me out. And Thomas fell before him and said here in verse 28, and Thomas answered and said unto him, what? My Lord and my God. And by the way, Isaiah 4:2, the branch of the Lord. So Jesus is the Lord and God. Jesus saith unto him, Thomas, because thou hast seen me, thou hast believed. But blessed are they that have not seen, and yet have believed. And many other signs truly did Jesus in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book, but these are written, that ye might believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that believing ye might have life through his name. So these four Gospels were written to document these four synoptic views of who the Messiah would in fact be. By the way, there were only those four views, hence four Gospels. Also, I would say 4 is called the number of the earth. So this and 2 is also the number of testimony. Whenever in the book of John, Jesus wanted you to pay special attention to something, he would repeat it. He would say not just truly or verily, but verily, verily, or truly, truly, or pay special attention. So you've got the number of testimony times 2, which is 4. And you've got these four Gospels. Now, John the Apostle had several disciples of his own. One was Polycarp, one was Ignatius, one was Papias. First century Christians. Polycarp had a disciple named Irenaeus. Irenaeus wrote a book called Against Heresies. 150, 160 AD, something like that, so a little over a century after the resurrection of Christ. But you can see that the disciple of the disciple of Jesus. So that's pretty close. That's pretty close. You got Jesus' disciple, which is John. You got John's disciple, which is Polycarp. And then you got Polycarp's disciple, which is Irenaeus. That's pretty close as far as being able to get the story right. By the way, they didn't have as books and things like we do. Now, obviously, the Jews were very literate people. And they did have vast libraries, but not as available as we do, and social media and everything else. Many traditions were taught and memorized. Many faith claims, statements of faith. As a matter of fact, I was about to say most rabbis. That's probably an accurate statement, although most rabbis I would have been able to quote the Torah from memory. Now, that's pretty good. Remember, Dave one time memorized, the first couple of chapters of Revelation. And he could reel off, about the first 2-3 chapters of Revelation. Boy, that's impressive. When you get somebody that can memorize that much and recount it. But imagine, so these guys were able to document history. And that wasn't the exception. That was more the norm. Now, what do? We can't even remember phone numbers because we save them all in our iPhones. So we don't have to remember them anymore. Boy, are we lazy. We are mentally lazy. And I'm number one on that list of being mentally lazy. All of us pale in comparison to what we could be if we really exercised our brains. But anyway, this is very close testimony. And Irenaeus said this: the heretics boast that they have many more gospels than there really are. By the way, have you heard that before? It was the Council of Nicaea that they decided on a certain number of books and only certain Gospels, and they discounted the rest of the Gospels, and all of them were just as valid as Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. As you can see by what we've just gone through tonight, that is not true biblically, not true Judaically. And here you've got Irenaeus against heresies. I noted when I got this quote was from 180 AD. The heretics boast that they have many more Gospels than there really are. But really, they don't have any Gospels that aren't full of blasphemy. There actually are only, how many? 4 authentic Gospels, and this is obviously true because there are 4 corners of the universe and 4 principal winds, 4 directions. That's why it's called the number of the earth, north, south, east, west. Therefore, there can only be 4 Gospels that are authentic. These besides are written by Jesus. These besides are written by Jesus' true followers. So you go all the way back to a little over a century after the time of Christ, and roughly a century from when, a little over a century from the time where all of the New Testament would have been compiled, with the exception of probably the book of John and Revelation. The book of John was probably written about 85 AD as John was getting up there, and Revelation was written in 96 AD, 95, 96 AD. Everything else was 65 AD, 64, 65 AD. Terry, you're about right. Early 60s AD and earlier. So literally just a little over a century from the time that the Bible was given, and less than 80 years from the time that the last book was added on there with the exclamation point saying, don't add to or take away from. We've got this, a student of Scripture, testifying that there were, in fact, only 4 Gospels. All right, well, folks, that is the lesson on the Synoptic Gospels.